Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Shannon. I'm a marine campaigner with the Victorian National Parks Association, and together with Paul, who's just on the screen here, who we'll hear from shortly from Lifesaving Victoria and the Association of Bayside Municipalities, we are facilitating our fifth and final webinar for our Nature of Change webinar series, which has been supported by the Victorian Government, which is all about Port Phillip Bay and exploring the changes over time of the bay and our incredible ecosystem, and the changes past, present and future in informing how we live, work and play among the bay and its shores. So, and we have been hearing from incredible experts who have informed us about these changes happening above and below the surface. So tonight's focus is on adapting to change, and we have two great speakers that you will hear from. Teresa Jones from Melbourne University's Urban Light Lab, who will be speaking on the impacts of artificial light on marine life, and Rebecca Price from the Victorian Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action, who will look ahead to the future planning that will inform how we adapt the way we live, work and play and access Port Phillip Bay and the priorities of Victoria's marine and coastal strategy and how we are currently tracking with those. So first of all, we'd like to recognise that Port Phillip Bay is an incredible part of sea country for the Bunurong people on the eastern and northern sides of the bay, and for the Wadawurrung people on the western sides, and acknowledge that there's such a rich cultural history that has been alive and cared for thousands and thousands of years. So we acknowledge elders past, present and future, and thank all traditional custodians for taking such great care of Port Phillip Bay. And to inspire us on how we can continue to tread lightly as we live, work and play on country. So how tonight will roll is we will hear from Teresa and Rebecca, and with their informative presentations first, and then we'll finish with a Q&A at the end. So if anyone's got any questions throughout their talks, please do pop them in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we will address those at the end of the evening. And then we'll finish up with some announcements for our final field trip, which we will tell you all about shortly, and then wrap up our final of our online versions of this webinar series. So I will hand over to Paul from LSV now, who's going to introduce our first speaker.
Thanks, Shannon. And, Lifesaving Victoria is thrilled to be partnering with Victorian National Parks and Association of Bayside Municipalities. We have 26 lifesaving clubs based around Port Phillip Bay, and largely our membership sees themselves as custodians of that land. So, they recreate, play there and work there. So this has been a really important project for us. So well done to all. Today, really looking forward to our first speaker, so Teresa Jones. She's a professor in the School of Biosciences, as Shannon mentioned, at the University of Melbourne. She's an evolutionary and behavioural ecologist who explores the ecological impact of light pollution. Her research has demonstrated the largely negative effects of artificial light at night on the behaviour and physiology of multiple animal species and their communities. She works with external stakeholders to translate academic knowledge into real-world solutions that mitigate the impact of light pollution for wildlife. So please welcome Teresa, and welcome.
No. Is that working? It's not working. How's that? Is that all good? Right. I'm just going to change the view that I have because you're all in my way. There we go. All right. I'm going to take a little bit of liberty and talk a little bit more about one of the projects. I thought it might be of interest to the people here today as well. So I'm going to expand my title a little bit to assessing and reducing nighttime lighting impacts on marine and coastal animals. I would also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians and owners of the unceded land on which I work, and where the majority of the work I'm going to be talking about that's related to the University of Melbourne has been undertaken. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and welcome any Indigenous peoples here today. I'm going to refer back to this image right at the end. I'm sure for most of you, you'll be familiar with what it is. I'd also like to acknowledge the people that have done all of this work. In fact, the person who's done the majority of the work I'm going to talk about in Port Phillip Bay is Hugh, here on the left-hand side. He's a master's student. Steve Swearer should have been giving this talk originally. He's hot-footed it off to Moorea, where he's looking at artificial light pollution, and which is why you have me. And another person who's integral to a lot of the work we've been doing in the Bay is Emily Faubert. So she is a research fellow, and they are far better able to talk about actually the marine pollution in the Bay, but hopefully I'll do their projects justice. So bear with me if I don't know as much about the marine environment. I'm actually a terrestrial ecologist by nature. So I thought before we start, we'd play a little game. Bear with me, it has relevance. All of you know the Where's Wally game. You know, you search really hard for Wally in a sea of all of these faces. Everyone's had a go with their kids. In case you're looking, he's there. I'd like to play a different game though, called Where's the Town? So Where's the Town is a slightly different version. And what we're going to do is I'd like you on this map of Australia, just mentally, to see if you could quickly, not the major cities that are easily marked, but could you label 10 to 15 towns with ease if I gave you 20 seconds? I think some of you would get close, but let me make it easier for you. This is an overlay of the light pollution map of Australia. Now bright areas are indicating where we have light pollution. If I make it easier for those of you who may be colourblind in the audience, and it easier for all of us, and put the colourblind version, now I think you could easily label 5, 10, maybe even 15 towns in Australia. You can easily pick them out. That's the degree of light pollution we have within the country. And imagine you're a bird flying over Australia. This is the view that you're now seeing. Light pollution has transformed our environment. So what I'd like to do today is do three things. I'd like to talk about the importance of light for life on Earth, because we can't talk about light pollution unless we understand how important light is for life on the planet. I'm going to highlight some areas where light pollution has been shown to be ecologically problematic. Some of those will be within the Bay, others will be research that I've undertaken, or at least my students have undertaken in my lab. And then finally, talk about a study in Port Phillip Bay that we're undertaking at the moment, which is a case study measuring light pollution and thinking about ways in which we can mitigate its impacts. So let's talk about the importance of light. Light is without doubt one of the most abiotic constancies that we've experienced for life on Earth. And what I mean by that is it's been a night and a day for pretty much the entire evolution of life on this planet for 4.5 billion years. In fact, if you brought back a Tyrannosaurus Rex from 65 million years ago to today, I mean, it would be fun, but what would be amazing is that the light that it would experience, the day and the night, would be almost identical to 65 million years ago. And life has evolved under this. Light is integral to our daily rhythm. All of the animals that you can see, including the human animal that you can see, has a light and dark cycle. Aligns in with us. During the daytime, we're awake. At nighttime, we're asleep. Nocturnal animals have a reverse cycle. So our daily rhythm is integrated with light. But seasonality is also integrated. I apologize for the European pictures, bear with me. I love spring and autumn, so that's what you've got at the moment. But seasons are actually driven not by temperature, which we often think of. You know, we often think, oh, it's getting warmer, it's now spring, it's going to be summer. But actually, what's changing more importantly is the amount of daytime. So the photo period is changing, and that defines our seasonality. And all of these plants, animals that you see, change with the seasons. They have summer coats, they have reproduction during the spring. But actually, it's not just the amount of daytime that we have. We also know that life varies with the lunar cycle. So over every 28 days, we have a new moon and a full moon. It goes on a 28-day cycle. Some animals are really more active during the full moon. This willy wagtail here is actually a nocturnal singer. I don't know if this is going to work. Oh, no, it didn't. I'll go back. Let's not worry about that. It tweets anyway. At nighttime during the mating season, the coral that you see here spawning, this mass spawning of coral, is on a full moon in a very short time period during October. Absolutely respond to full moon. But the other animals that you see will be less visible during the full moon. They prefer new moons where predation risk is much lower. A full moon, much more visible. You can read under the light of the full moon. But what's interesting, the reason that lunar cycle there is that 28% of vertebrates and 63% of invertebrates are nocturnal, and 30% of threatened species live in cities, including in Australia, our coastal cities. And this is what the whole world looks like at night. So I've already shown you Australia, but this is the nighttime sky now. The redder it is, the more light polluted it is. So you can see Australia's not so bad. Bless you, Shannon. But the rest of the world is highly light polluted, Europe, Asia, and North America. Edison introduced the electric light bulb around about 150, 180 years ago. And it's said that he said, we will make electricity so cheap that only the rich will burn tallow candles. But I really don't think even he would have imagined that the nighttime sky would look like this. And what's important and pertinent to this talk is that 30% of our coastlines are now light polluted. And in Australia, that's very true. We have light pollution, and Port Phillip Bay in particular is quite light polluted. So light is really important for life on Earth, but what does it do? Let's look at light pollution. So imagine now we've evolved for 4.5 billion years under these amazing day-night cycles. They're superbly important for our daily activity, our seasonal activity, and also nighttime activity. Now we're going to throw lights globally and see what happens. Light pollution is defined as excessive, misdirected, and intrusive artificial light. I put these pictures in. I literally took my dog for a walk and took photos of light polluted areas on my walk. So these are within about less than a 1K radius of my home. This is my own security light, which is on a timer that only comes on while I'm there. But all of these other lights are permanent fixtures within my local environment. There is a tawny frogmouth in the top picture here, top right picture you can see. So we have animals living in these environments. But this bottom left-hand photo here is my son's local footy ground. And in the background, you can see the full moon as a comparator within that environment. What we know about light at night is that it disrupts the movement and activity patterns, not only of humans. Let's make no mistake, that's the reason it's put there in the first place, so our own activity is disrupted, but it also changes activity patterns of animals, both on land and in the oceans. It changes migration, it changes daily patterns. What you can see in that top right is the migration of large numbers of birds. And what we know about bird species now is during these migrations, they will settle and be drawn towards areas of light pollution, which are not necessarily the places they would have ordinarily landed upon. We've all seen the turtle story where the turtles emerge from their nests and they flap their way towards the ocean with predators trying to get them. It's a very precarious journey. What they're doing is heading towards the brightest light on the horizon, and that should be the moon reflecting off the horizon. On beaches with lights, that moon that I just showed you competing with that street light is happening in coastal regions. The turtles turn and face inland and they move towards those beach lights. That can increase their predation risk. They can get drown in people's pools, and they also get run over. So it's massively important. Light at night can attract, and we know that. A moth to a flame is something that's almost poetic, but when we increase the number of individuals, like in that top left-hand picture, or we have massive swarms like this, we can see that light can attract not just a single individual, it can change whole communities or the distribution of those communities. And similar things happen in an aquatic environment. I'm going to show you some video of that in a moment. What light is doing under those examples is creating what we call an ecological trap. And an ecological trap is where animals, or indeed plants, end up somewhere which is detrimental to their survival. It's not beneficial, but they can become stuck there. And in the case of light, in those images that you see, the bridge that you see, the tribute of lights that we have in New York, and also those headlights, is that animals are attracted and then become disoriented. That deer is now functionally blind. It doesn't know what to do, and it's trapped in those lights. In the tribute of lights has led to the death. I'm sorry, this is a negative slide. There's a positive to follow, I promise. Has led to the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands or millions of birds. They become so disoriented, they become trapped there until either the lights turn off or they die. And that's what New York now does. So in the tribute of lights, they have people counting the total number of birds that they see in there. When they reach a certain number, they turn the lights off, allowing those animals to be released from that ecological trap. So something so simple as just turning the lights off for 40 minutes can actually relieve the pressure on this ecological system. And humans exploit it. Fish do the same thing. Fish are inordinately attracted to light at night. Here we have a green light that's been deployed for fishing, and it's attracting globefish at Port Phillip Bay. Here you have toadfish having a lovely time hanging out under a light at Lagoon Pier. Those little, I'm assured that these are fish by my marine colleagues. And here under Blackberry Pier, you can see hundreds, oh, hang on a second, of fish also, of mackerel under a shallow amber light. You can see how bright that light is from the pier, how far it extends into the coastal environment. One of the other things that we know is that light masks those natural light cycles. I've just said that they're so important for a range of different species, but light itself can mask the cycle itself. So all of these species that you can see are seasonal breeders. The crickets, I work on these, the wallabies, the wagtails, and these coral all breed seasonally. And what we know is that they breed under specific lunar cycles, and that artificial light can mask the signal of light that they need. In the case of the wagtail and the coral, it's because it masks the full moon, but in the case of the other two species, it's masking that photo period that I just talked about, total number of hours of sunlight in a day, because as the photo period elongates, it's an indicator of spring. And why is this a problem is something that we raised in a paper recently. If you imagine a wallaby, and wallabies are born, usually the parents gestate, the female gestates, produces a wallaby in spring and summer, tight production of total number of offspring, linked entirely to the product or the production of food. And that's perfect because there's lots of food available. What light at night does is it confuses the hormones of the wallaby. And what happens now is that individual offspring start getting born over a much greater period of time. And if the food doesn't align perfectly, there's no longer a food source available. So this disruption of these cycles in different species can have a massive impact, and it can lead to individuals having offspring at times where food is no longer plentiful, and that's highly problematic. More broadly, light pollution is implicated in biodiversity declines, so that we know there's links now to high areas or high incidence of light pollution with a reduced number of species, and this is massively problematic. So what I want to do now is talk about how we go about addressing this as scientists, what we can do, and how we then integrate this with the community. This is a study in Port Phillip Bay, and it's got three aims. The first is to measure the amount of light within the bay. The second is to monitor the impact in terms of biodiversity. And the third is to identify actions and how we can move forward. I'm going to talk a little bit about the first one, the second and third one we're starting, but I don't have data yet. So this is Port Phillip Bay. Notice how light polluted it is and how much light pollution is going into the oceans. And this is a scene from Lagoon Pier of coastal light pollution. It's a little bit blurry, but I kind of like that. It's showing how much light is there and how much light is going into the oceans. So the first thing we're doing is looking at how much light actually goes from there down into the water. And this is Hugh. He's dropped what we call light loggers at 5 piers, and he's dropped them down into the water down to 10 meters and raised them up again. We're measuring how much light is available at those different depths. This is Portsea Pier, is one of the ones. You can see that green fishing light that I just showed you with those fish. There it is in the water. We're also doing it at Kerford Pier, Lagoon Pier, Blairgowrie Pier, and Sorrento Pier. And you can see that each of these lights and piers look slightly different. And we're measuring how much of the light, not as on the surface though, how much goes down. So at Blairgowrie Pier, this is the setup that we have. We've got sites that have got lights, they're the little yellow dots, but we're also putting it as sites with no lights to see whether in between the lights you still have light pollution. So at Blairgowrie Pier, we have 6 sites. Sorrento, we have 7, and you can see the lights there too. And at Portsea, we have 10 different sites, and we're measuring the depths at all of these different sites. So this is science in action. This is kind of the glamorous end of it, but Hugh not only tests these, he's built all of these loggers in the lab. It's taken hundreds of hours to actually develop the equipment that we use. And sometimes you have to troubleshoot at unearthly hours. It is one of the disadvantages of working on light pollution, is that a lot of your work is done quite late at night. He's lying down in a car park troubleshooting some of the equipment. So what did we find? This is the only graph I'm going to show you, and bear with me, I'll talk you through it. So what you can see here on the bottom axis here, that we call it here, these are levels of light. 0 lux is not very much light, and 10 lux is about the light that you'd see if you stood directly under a street light. Each of these lines that you see is the lines of the piers that you've got on the left-hand side. So Blairgowrie, Kerford, Lagoon, and Sorrento. And each of these dots is a measurement of light. And what we've done is we've taken the light logger from the top, and this is the top of the surface of the ocean, and then we've dropped it down into the water, and we've raised it back up again, and we've measured light levels at each of these depths. What you can see is that the piers vary a lot in the amount of light. So you can see here that Lagoon at 0 is already at about 10 lux. It's like being under a street light in the water. You can see that the others vary are much less bright, and that Sorrento is quite dim. And if I quickly go back there, you can kind of see that from the photos that I can show you of the piers themselves. What's interesting though is that light is traveling beyond about 3 to 4 meters. So at 3 to 4 meters, this line here, you can still see quite a lot of light present in the water. And the other thing I want you to take away, at these levels are way higher than natural moonlight. I'm going to put natural moonlight light levels on now. They're about here. Any dot that is to the left-hand side of this is much brighter than even the brightest full moon evening. So the levels of light, even down at 1 meter, 2 meters, and 3 meters, are way brighter in the vast majority of the piers. And if I change this to brighter than moonlight as my axis, you can see that light levels at Lagoon are 300, 200, and even still 100 times brighter than full moonlight, even 2 meters down. And that's quite a depth under the surface. So the next thing that we want to do is test whether that sky glow, that light pollution into the oceans, is masking our lunar cycles. So is the light competing with the light from the moon? What we're doing here is, I don't have the data for this, I'll just quickly tell you what we're doing. So we're going to deploy loggers at different sites over the new moon and full moon, and we're going to get levels of natural light from these loggers and also levels of moonlight. And we'll be able to see whether those lights are actually masking the natural moonlight cycle. The first time we did this, we got 0 lux under a light. And it turns out that some of the study animals don't necessarily play ball. This is an 11-armed sea star that sat on the light logger and covered it entirely for the period of time we had it down there. So, you know, we do have to teach the animals to play if we're going to do anything for them. But it does happen, and we obviously, it's a cool animal. The next thing that we're doing is we're taking those light measurements, that's the physical properties, but we're actually looking to see whether that changes diversity. So we have a camera set up and infrared lights, and we're going to be measuring diversity of the animals down there. On the left-hand side, you can see the setup. This is it being made, and this is it deployed. Here you can see there's a stingray next to the camera setup. Here we have a tire with a blue fish. I was told the name of the fish and I've forgotten it. Someone can tell me that one. But this is the type of footage that we can get from these cameras. Here you've got a magpie fish. There's going to be a smooth stingray coming through in a moment at the bottom. You can just see it coming into view, and you get a school of mackerel. We can use these images to measure diversity of the visual environment that we can see. But we're also going to be measuring diversity on land. The coastal environment includes the land as well. But this time we're going to use acoustic monitoring. I've been using this in my lab for a long time. So instead of measuring what we can see, we measure what we can hear. And we use these recorders. We've done it successfully in a range of different species. And on the right-hand side, you can see Ashton Dickerson. That's the first recorder we used in my lab about 8 years ago. And we can measure soundscapes. This is what they look like. Hopefully you can hear this one. This is a willy wagtail singing nocturnally at night. Our data's shown that the willy wagtail sings most during the night, during the mating season. It's attracting females. Many of you may not have even heard or seen them do that, but they will do this extensively and throughout the mating period. We're going to do this on land. We're going to use things called audio moths. This is a study I'm doing at the moment in South Australia, again, looking at light pollution, but in a terrestrial environment. We may deploy hydro moths as well, a hydro version of these acoustic recorders to measure the diversity that we see. We'll be able to talk to you about that in a year's time when we've gathered all the data in that time period. I want to just end though very quickly on thinking about light pollution, because one of the things I've realized is it's actually really difficult. It's the easiest pollutant. I could go and turn light pollution off right now by flicking a switch on my wall. But actually it's very difficult to do that, because light is so intertwined with human emotion and social context. And so mitigation measures for light pollution, I've realized, must balance human conflict. These lights are here so my kids can be active. This security light is here so we can be safe. It's actually quite bright though, and what you probably do is that. And if you did that, you'll realize that bright glary lights are not necessarily safe either. I'm going to cough, excuse me. Sorry. In terms of the coastal environment, fishermen are using lights. We need to mitigate strategies for them too. Sorry, lost my voice. That green light is being used. It's deployed very deliberately to catch fish. So we need to mitigate and balance the conflict that we have with the fishermen. Light fishing at Portsea is a really important social event. It's a very popular thing. And so we need to make sure that anything we do coordinates with these people. What we can do right now, though, is return to my image. This is the emu rising, and it's a beautiful metaphor for what we need to do from the outset to mitigate light pollution. E is for eliminate light where we can. If you don't need it, don't put it there. M is for mitigate. Shield lights, reduce their spill and glare. Those peer photos showed you how different those lights can be. Make sure they face down. Don't go into the oceans or beyond where they need to be. Change the timing. Turn them off if you can. The colour, Blague-Arry, if you notice, was quite yellow. We know that that's actually better. Reduce the intensity where you can. And the most important thing, particularly, I mean, I'm quite biased, obviously, is understand impact. Assessment is critical. If we don't know what we've got, we don't know how to save it. If we don't understand the impact, we don't know how to mitigate. So that's really important. I'll end with this photo. It's taken from Serendip Sanctuary, which is just outside Lara. That is not sunrise or sunset. That is Melbourne, 60 kilometres away. That's how far light pollution can travel, and it's what we're dealing with both on land and in the oceans. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Teresa. Absolutely, dare I say, enlightening. That'd be a very bad dad joke, I know.
I've had worse.
And I'm sure we're going to have a few questions there at the end. I've certainly got a couple myself that I will park. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Rebecca Price. She's the Principal Policy Officer at DECA in the Marine and Coastal Policy Unit. Rebecca was an integral member of the team that developed the Marine and Coastal Act 2018. She knows that I pester her about that on a regular time. She led the development of the Marine and Coastal Transition Plan in 2018, the Marine and Coastal Policy 2020, and the Marine and Coastal Strategy 2022. And I'm sure she can tell us where the thinking is moving towards moving into our future and wrapping up our program. So welcome, Rebecca. Great to have you.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Shannon and everyone for inviting me to come along. And thanks, Teresa, for a really interesting presentation. I'm afraid I'm going to twist to something much broader. So looking at legislation, policy and strategy, but also hopefully with a little focus at the end on what's happening in Port Phillip Bay and where we see things heading for Port Phillip Bay as well. So I'm going to get used to a Zoom screen and share my screen, and hopefully it'll work. Can people see that? Is that working? Excellent. Okay. So it is a talk about the Marine and Coastal Strategy, and it's really going to look a little bit at where the strategy has come from and what it's saying about where we'd like to go in the future. I'd like to take this time to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that I'm coming from, which is the Boonwurrung people, and also Port Phillip Bay, and all the traditional owners of the lands that you're all coming from, which could be Port Phillip Bay or could be wider. I'm not sure. And pay my respects to elders past and present. So so I'm going to, number one, do a little bit of a high level talk about the Act itself, so the Marine Coastal Act, and then a little bit more about the policy, and then onto the strategy, highlight a few of the things that have happened in its first year of implementation that are still progressing, and then a little bit more focus on some of that work that's been happening in Port Phillip Bay, which I'm sure you all know about, but just see it within the context of the Act policy and strategy. So the Marine Coastal Act came in 2018, and it really it was the next generation from the Coastal Management Act of 1995. And some of the key things that it was trying to do was really try to get a whole of government approach to how we looked at the marine and coastal environment, give us much stronger emphasis on the marine environment than the previous piece of legislation had, and really tried to become an enabling act that looked at how we integrate and coordinate what we do and how we manage this environment. What it does, it sets 9 objectives, and 7 guiding principles. And they're really about how we go about managing, making decisions and going forward in this very dynamic environment, and also very precious and very essential for the well-being of our entire environment, but really for the well-being of the people of Melbourne. So Port Phillip Bay is so significant in that way. So the the Act sets up a hierarchy of planning tools, and it sets up state level tools that apply across the state, regional based tools, of which I'll talk about some and how they're being applied in Port Phillip Bay. Local based tools, again, coastal marine management plans is one of the key planning tools along our foreshores around the bay. And then we have a very much site-specific sort of regulation tool around how you use and develop this very fragile and dynamic environment. So at that state level, we've got the policy, the strategy, and then we also have a State of Marine and Coastal Environment report that feeds into the development of the strategy going forward. So the first comprehensive across the whole state Marine and Coastal Environment report is due early 2025, and that's delivered by the Commissioner for the Environment. So the Marine and Coastal Policy is a really important, so that the Act calls for a policy to be made, and the policy sets the vision for how we want to move forward and what we want to achieve within the marine and coastal environment. So we want a healthy, dynamic, biodiverse environment that's valued in its own right and benefits the community now and into the future. Importantly, it's a policy that has a life of around 15 years, and there is a very elaborate process to amend that policy going forward. So it sets the vision, long-term outcomes. It provides guidance to decision makers on how they can and should consider things in order to meet the objectives of the Act. And to do that, it establishes what we call the planning and decision pathway, which really helps decision makers know which of the objectives I need to consider, in what order, and how I might go about doing things. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And importantly for marine environments, like the Bay, it includes Victoria's first marine spatial planning framework. And where I'm saying it's quite a complex document, it has a 15-year life, but to change it and even to get it approved, it requires it needs all those ministers to actually approve the contents of the document. So it is a whole of government document. So all those ministers have to sign off on it. And for that reason, we usually go to Cabinet, so that it's not only those ministers, but we also get the Premier and the Treasurer signing off on anything. So any of the actions within it. Well, the guiding principles and the things within the policy and the actions within the strategy. So going back to this planning and decision pathway, and this is really the core of both what's coming out of the Act, what's in the policy, and also then translates to the actions that we want to deliver on the ground and in the strategy. So we have guiding principles that are actually outlined in the legislation. And then we have a series of objectives. And some of those objectives about what you need to consider when you make a decision, and some are about how you go about making those decisions. So the things you need to consider, we've given an order to. So when you are making a decision in the marine and coastal environment, first thing to think about is, have you acknowledged traditional owner rights, aspirations, and knowledge in that area? Second, are we protecting and enhancing the marine and coastal environment? So what are those intrinsic values and the goods and the benefits that we get? So things like clean water, fresh air, fish food, you know, those types of things, really important things. Do we understand and respect that this is a really dynamic environment and there's lots of processes happening and it changes every day? with tides, with wind, with waves, with sand movements, with people coming, going, what we do, how we act, and all those types of things. And then also considering how, with our understanding of these things, how can we actually then build some sort of resilience to change? Because not only the changes we know happen all the time, but we know there's potential changes coming with climate change in the future. And hopefully if we've gone through all that and the policies there to guide, we can then actually use and develop sustainably. And there's some further principles about that. And some of the other tools to help us do that is like taking a stewardship approach, using the latest science. So working on the work that Theresa's team's coming up with about light pollution, feeding that into how we then go about making decisions, engaging with as many communities as we can, and collaborating. And I think I really wanted to emphasize how important collaboration is, and it is part of the whole process of which we're trying to deliver all these things together, because there is such a diversity of organisations involved. Everyone has a potential role. It's not one person's role or another, it's how everyone comes together. And what we're aiming for is that the Act, policy and strategy become this framework for collaboration. I did want to just pull out Marine Spatial Planning Framework because that is included in the policy. It's not explicitly within the objectives of the Act, but it is a really important document, and the objectives apply no matter where you make a decision. But the framework is actually, again, it's about that use of collaboration to actually integrate and coordinate how we plan and manage in the marine environment. So it's trying to get people pulling together. So Part A has specific guidance on how to integrate and coordinate when making decisions, and that very much linked to the planning and decision pathway, also in the policy. And Part B is actually a process for how might we actually develop a marine spatial plan. We haven't got one yet. There's a lot of work going on, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the work that's happening, looking at where a marine spatial plan is one of those tools we could use to actually achieve more integrated and coordinated planning in our marine spaces. So that's a quick outline of the policy, and it sort of gives you an idea. So each of those, the plan and decision pathway, the broad objectives of the Act, then have outcomes, and within that then there's small p policies about direction, about what you should consider, particularly when you're using and developing. The Marine and Coastal Strategy is actually then the action plan. So the Act says that we need to have a 5-year action plan that's to deliver on the policy, basically. So given that the policy has a 15-year lifespan, we'll have 3 5-year strategies within the life of the policy. So the current Marine and Coastal Strategy is the first of potentially 3 strategies to try to implement the policy. So implement the outcomes and eventually try to achieve the vision in the policy. What the strategy does is it identifies 6 priority actions for this first 5 years. And you'll see that they're very much linked to the themes within the planning and decision pathway and those key objectives within the Act. Again, I'll note it is very much a whole of government approach. So all these actions have been signed off by all those ministers, and they're being progressed in different parts by all those ministers and all their portfolios as well. So the first action is to really look at trying to embed or help traditional owners to determine how they want their rights and obligations embedded into the planning and management going forward. So it's very much with a self-determination focus. And it's working with traditional owners about how they want things to happen. The other really important aspect of the Marine and Coastal Strategy is it was developed in partnership with the registered Aboriginal parties along the coast. And they wrote a really important message, which is contained within the strategy, which really highlights how they want to work with everyone who's involved in implementing the strategy going forward, about getting that listening, talking, working together, and really on how they are delivering most of the activities within Action 1. And it's how we can work with them to deliver things going forward. I should say that we have these 6 high-level actions, and underneath that is 54 activities. So the activities are more like the projects that someone might be doing, and I'll go into some of those projects or programs, and they will have, each project and program has its own time frame and responsibilities for delivery over that 5-year time. Action 2 is really almost a 2-parter. It's about, as much as we can, improving condition and ecological connectivity of our habitats, but at the same time, how do we improve how our population and all of us respect and care for these marine and coastal areas. So it's sort of really important, but it's a lot of the work about volunteers on the coast are doing a lot of the work, which really helps about improving the condition and the ecological connectivity of areas. Action 3 is adapting to the impacts of climate change. And there's specific activities under Action 3 really around coastal hazards and planning, and it's quite long. But I will say that probably there's activities in all those actions that relate to how we will adapt to climate change going forward. So adapting to climate change includes improving our condition and ecological connectivity. So it's about looking at it all together. Supporting sustainable use and development. So here the real focus is on having as much strategic planning in place, so we know where are the places we want to protect and value, and where are the places we can develop. How can we enjoy things without detrimental impact on the things we want to do? We actually then have an action about implementing the marine spatial planning framework. And the final action is how we better identify what we need going forward, particularly if we're going to have the resources to adapt and implement as we go forward. I've got this slide in just to say that we are actively trying to help this collaborative process through the development of the strategy. And we've done that in its actual governance framework. So what we have is a Marine and Coastal Strategy Collaboration Network, which is really members, every entity and people that are involved in delivering actions within the strategy get together, and it's about opportunities to progress and share ideas. And we're hoping to have some more of that program going forward this year. We also have at a very high level an interagency implementation committee. So we have some of the key government agencies involved who have those action leads, so that those portfolios that represent those different ministers actually come together, and they have signed off, for example, on last year's annual report and on the monitoring, evaluation and reporting framework, which will hopefully be getting out soon to members of the collaboration network. So I thought that also we have as part of that reporting, we've had our first year reporting, and we know there's a lot of stuff going on. There is a lot of work happening by all the different leads, and we have a vast variety of leads. However, I thought I would have a bit of a deeper sort of government focus on some of the key actions that are being delivered, and then go into a little bit more about specific ones, some of those ones bolded, that are happening in Port Phillip Bay at the moment. So we've got in terms of Action 1, we have a grant program working with traditional owners, and they determine which of the key activities they want to invest in. So we've had some great sea ranger programs happening. We've got some, what am I talking about? Country plans in development. We've had some blue carbon work, blue carbon mapping work happening around the bay. Yeah, so that's a real sort of coordinated group that's being pulled together. And part of this sort of collaboration is that all the RAPs are meeting meeting monthly to talk about how they're implementing the strategy and actions within the strategy and some of the issues that they may face. In terms of Action 2, one of the key ones that I'll go into a little bit more is the Port Phillip Bay Environmental Management Plan, which is achieving some really good things. That's actually the Bay's Environmental Management Plan was one of the things that was built into the legislation. The EMP for Port Phillip Bay had existed previously. It was a tool that the Environment Protection Authority was using. And when we developed the Marine and Coastal Act, it was thought, yeah, this is a really good home. It gives it a much stronger legislative backing as something that's really important to go forward. But also we have an ability to create environmental management plans for other areas in the marine environment as well through the Act. We've got some blue carbon work happening. We've had lots of mapping, and we're really looking at trying to develop up a framework to enhance more blue carbon opportunities. And of course, Coast Care keeps going. In terms of Action 3, I realised time, and I'll be really quick. The Victorian Resilience Coast, I'll talk a bit more about that. We've got some pilot regional and strategic partnerships happening, and we are still working to review with an intent to update the sea level rise planning benchmark based on the latest science going forward. Action 4, we've got coastal marine management plans. We've got all the work that's happening, looking at beach renourishments. There's some works fixing up sea walls. We're also continuing to deliver the offshore wind implementation statements. And then other government agencies are also delivering things under the strategy, like the recreational boating strategy, local ports framework, and commercial port strategy. In marine spatial planning, I'll go into a little bit about the guidelines and planning areas and how they relate to Port Phillip Bay. And then in terms of identifying resources, we have scoped a plan to look at environmental economic account and done some mapping of existing funding sources going forward to go into the next steps on that one. So I was just going to quickly highlight, I am conscious of the time, sorry, if I'm too long, that's fine. So some of the key projects that are happening in Port Phillip Bay, the Port Phillip Bay Environmental Management Plan, you may have already had a talk in this program around that. I'm not sure. I'm assuming you may have. It has been around since 2017, but it gives you an idea of the amount of plantings, areas that have been rehabilitated, partnership programs, and I know that the recent Port Phillip Bay Fund grant applications have just closed, so hopefully there's a lot of really good work again that should be funded through that, which all should relate to implementing the environmental management plan. One of the key highlights that has come out of DCOC, I think, has been the Victorian Resilient Coast Adapting for 2100 framework, which is really about a process. It's a program that includes a framework, which is this process that you can see, a series of guidelines and funding support. And it's really there to develop up a strategic approach to how we're going to look at the long-term management of coastal hazard risk. And it is I think the uptake of this program has been amazing, because my next slide just goes to show the number of projects that have either received funding through the grant program or through other means. So, for example, the Port Phillip Bay Western Shorelines RASP, which is our second regional and strategic partnership, that's kicking off. But all these projects, which is almost looking at the whole bay, are looking at developing, using the Victorian Resilient Coast framework to look at adaptation planning and what their needs are. So in a way, we've actually got really good progress in trying to get to consider adaptation around Port Phillip Bay. I'm hoping that you have had a bit of a more in-depth conversation or presentation on the Port Phillip Bay Coastal Hazard Assessment that came out in January this year. It is an amazingly detailed but a really, really useful tool, and it fills the part 3 of the framework, which is actually what are the hazards that we are going to expect? What are the coastal hazards we're going to see in the future or likely to see in the future? And it maps these likely hazards for erosion, storm tide inundation, permanent inundation, and groundwater changes, which are all really important. I've just grabbed the snapshot of the whole bay in storm tide inundation. So you can see a little bit, it's a bit hard there, but obviously it maps it at different scenarios of sea level rise. So 0.5 meters, 0.8 meters, and 1.1 meters. So I do encourage everyone to type in Port Phillip Bay Coastal Hazard Assessment if you haven't already had a look. Go in and have a look, and there's some really good plain English documents in there which help to explain the maps, and then the technical reports if you want to go in there. But that's a really, really useful tool for us to think about what are we going to need to adapt to in the future. Feeding into all this is the Victorian Coastal Monitoring Program, which is looking at ongoing monitoring of waves, wind and sediments in various sites around the bay. And I think you may have definitely had Jack come in and do a presentation on this. Yeah. So this is just something I grabbed from Jack, but it is a really useful tool, and it's giving us that real-time data so that we can build all that into our modelling, into our decision-making as we go forward. The Coastal Marine Management Plan guidelines. So we have the guidelines were released late last year. We also had a grants program last year, and some of the areas around the bay that got some funding to help implement their plans are highlighted there. And we're soon to release a resource kit, which is a series of templates to further help development of coastal marine management plans, which are really important at that foreshore management aspect of the planning at that sort of local scale. And really that sort of leans into what is appropriate, where do we want to have our activity nodes, where do we want to have our recreational areas, and where are those areas we need to protect and create those habitat corridors and things like that. And then my final slide is to not forget marine spatial planning, because we're talking about a bay, and that is one of our marine spatial planning areas. So potential area of importance where we may do marine spatial plans if things turn out that way. We're currently looking, in terms of marine spatial planning, we're currently supporting offshore wind development at the moment. That's one of the key focuses, and informing and recognising cultural landscapes and values into how we go forward. And that's my contact details if anyone would like to get me. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. It's a very complex arena for some of us to try and delve into. So I greatly admire your ability to get across so much content and have so many moving parts in what you do in protecting the Port Phillip Bay. So huge congratulations to you and your team on that. Certainly what sort of stuck out for me, that the coordination and collaboration piece, you know, and that everyone has skin in the game, you know, whether government, community, industry, the different levels of government becomes really resonates with me in that it's not a particular government agency that's going to move the dial on this. It's everyone having buy-in and actually taking part. And so I commend you and your team and your efforts. And with that, I might swing over to Shannon, see first of all if we've got any questions before I fire a couple of my own. Assuming I've got the microphone at the moment, so we'll go to the audience. Shannon.
Thanks, Paul, and echoing Paul's words, thank you, Rebecca and Teresa. It was really great to hear from both of you. We have just Rebecca Olive has posted a recommendation to a lovely book on the importance of dark skies by Danny Robinson. So there's a link to that book. So if anyone wants that, that's in the chat there. We've also got a question from Sue to you, Teresa, saying that we have an issue with light installation for Harry Potter at the Briars on the Mornington Peninsula. And so your presentation highlights the concerns we have on the wildlife at the sanctuary. Would you be available to provide your expertise in order to educate the effects of artificial light on our nocturnal creatures?
Yeah, I've actually been involved in this already. So I was contacted by the community group a while ago before it all got approved, and I commented through all the different frequently asked questions and put comments, and that went through when you guys were actually applying to have it moved to a different location. I know it's still problematic. I would definitely be able to have a chat. Webinar is probably better for me than any other means, but certainly I'd be happy to chat. If you want to just email me, Shannon or Paul can provide email details.
Thanks, Teresa. And we've got another one from Chris, who's asking if the Victorian Fisheries Authority have been made aware of the impact of nightlight on fish populations. Note, attractant to squid, well known, but not regulated.
I don't know, actually. They should know that they are attracted. I don't know is the answer. They should be aware. There is always that conflict. You know, what I said at the end is the major problem that we have. I think it's humans are very happy to do things if it doesn't necessarily directly impact them. And then there's often a problem if it does. And that's not a criticism, it's a statement of fact. If there is a cost, then it becomes more problematic. And I think that's one of the problems with light pollution in particular.
Thank you. And yeah, Sue says thank you. And
it's just like my email address is teresa@unimelb.edu.au. It's very easy. So I was the first one in. So
great. Thank you. And just a reminder for anyone still in the audience, please feel free to pop in questions for both Rebecca and Teresa. Paul, you had some questions, so go for it.
Yeah. So two questions. One, lighting design. Is work being done in that field with regards to, you know, it's just beggars belief, say, to walk through a city and see vacant office blocks with lights on everywhere, they stay on all night. You know, is there some sort of design element that can hold the light, or is work being done in this space? And again, even just thinking of the peers and whatnot, is there a solution to the pollution or reducing the amount of pollution from a design perspective?
Yeah, totally. And sorry, I've got a cold, which is why I'm struggling a bit at the moment. I talk a lot with lighting designers. One of my collaborators is actually involved in that project with me, kind of putting a thing in a tree, is to do with lighting design. So they've developed lights that have got really good shielding. They're knocking out blue light. I didn't talk about that tonight, but blue light is known to be more problematic than some of the other lights, particularly in a coastal environment, actually, because blue light penetrates through the water far better than others' colours of lighting. So there is lots of work being done. A number of different companies, lighting designers, lighting developers as well, are looking at this. The light pollution guidelines, which have been were produced by the federal government, are a really good document to have a look at. There's some really good suggestions within that. And certainly people are starting to take note. They're starting to shield. I don't know if you down in Phillip Island, the Penguin Parade redid their lighting. We actually were down there doing a project at the time, and we said, "Oh, it's not great." They took that on board, and it's better shielded. It's amber lighting. It's not blue lighting. They actually retrofitted filters on there to reduce the impact. It's happening. It's happening slowly, and it tends to be context or company dependent, and that's because the Australian and New Zealand guidelines are guidelines, and they have minima, but they have no maxima. So there are no guidelines for maximal levels at the moment. There's suggestions, but no actual guidelines. Minimum are in there, and that is typically where government industry ends up. Yeah.
And the second part was probably more a comment, but there does seem to be a bit of a community groundswell in regional places with regards to declaring themselves as
dark sky,
removing light pollution and the like. Certainly the area that I live, which is coastal, there's a bit of a movement around it, but clearly there's an education element for people that who can find barriers against those sorts of things. So any comments to that? Are you seeing that across the, is that a national?
Yeah, look, I know Victoria best, to be honest. I'll comment within Victoria rather than nationally. I don't really know at national level, but I would totally agree with you that it tends to be grassroots movements, community movements driving some of this. And we've had lots of discussions about why this is happening. And I've done a little bit of work in the city of Melbourne, for example, and it's less of a community feel there or push. And I think, well, Melbourne is obviously quite bright. But I think the other thing is that emotional tie to the environment. I do think it's that protection of country, if it's in your own local environment and it's where you are. Whereas places like Melbourne have got so many tourists, people that come in and come out to work, and they're not as embedded within there. I think that partly changes the nature of the conversation and the feeling towards that environment. I think those small communities where it's your environment, it's your home, it's your country, actually are really are going to benefit, actually, because I think they're the ones that are going to be protected. They're certainly the ones, when I talk to councils, they have the easiest job convincing their communities that turning lights off is not such a bad thing, and actually you can manage without them. Protecting your environment at the expense of this is something you might want to do because it's the health of your area. So that's a long-winded answer to yes.
Thanks, Teresa. Paul, I'm going to have to put you on hold for 2 seconds. We've got some more questions that have come in from the audience. So Rebecca, the next few are for you. So we've got from Kay, who has 2 questions. So I might just ask the first one first. Will there be guidelines for developers so we don't get tied up in a lengthy process like Toondah Harbour, I'm assuming that Kay means?
So the Marine Coastal Policy itself is a guideline for anyone that's making decisions or proposing development. So it actually does provide those parameters by which, if something is proposed, it must meet those considerations, because it shouldn't be approved unless it has met the requirements under the legislation. That's when it's on marine and coastal crown land, which I'm assuming this marina may have been. So in a way, the policy itself provides that guidance about what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, what you need to consider, and how you need to go about considering those things. Hopefully that has answered that. Do you want me to go on to the next one?
If you can see it, Rebecca, yeah, go.
Yeah, I can see it. I've got it right
Great.
here. So this one I think is, will the offshore wind farms be away from the migratory bird flight paths? That is one of the really important, so that's why we're trying to work with the wind farms in terms of looking at the principles within the marine spatial planning framework and the principles within the policy, because it does follow that planning decision pathway, you know, traditional owner rights, aspirations for that area, what are the values we need to protect in that area. And so they're really important aspects that should be considered when we look at where is appropriate for new developments like offshore wind. So migratory bird flight paths are really important. We have international agreements in place to protect these habitats and those areas. So if we are trying to apply marine spatial planning, we need to consider that within it. Yep.
Great, thank you. And we've got another one for you as well, from another Rebecca. In terms of navigating adaptation and resilience actions, how do the challenges of policy strategy implementation compare between homeowners and recreational users, or are they very linked?
All right, I'm having a good look at this one. I'm trying to so I think they are linked, but it's also about applying the principles of the pathway in terms of trying to get both those user groups together to understand. So the Resilient Coast Adaptation Framework is about everyone getting together to identify what the values are, understanding then what the hazards are that may impact those values in the future, and then what are our options, what's most at risk, and what are the options going forward from there. So it is a process. There will always be those sorts of tensions, but part of the process is to try to get some sort of understanding from both different interest groups, so that they have, we can come up with some sort of solution that has some acceptance from everyone. It may never end up in that way, but the idea is that there is a process that's outlined that is clear and transparent, so people can listen to the other person's perspective and understand where the decisions may have come from. I'm hoping that sort of addressed the question.
That's great. Thanks, Rebecca. Well, I think that's all the questions we have time for this evening. If anyone else has got any burning questions that didn't get answered, feel free to get in touch. An email, I think Teresa's given you her email previously, and also Rebecca had hers on the screen, but if you need to, you can always contact the VNPA and we're happy to pass anything on. But thank you so much again for your time, Rebecca and Teresa, and sharing all your expertise with us this evening. For anyone that wants to rewatch this recording or watch all the previous 4 webinars that we've hosted as part of this series, they are on VNPA's YouTube account, which the link will be placed in the Q&A section very shortly, and we'll once again send an email out. Yeah, so this is the last webinar of our series. So for those who have joined, thank you all so much for joining us over the past few months as we've been delivering just the changes around Port Phillip Bay from history, present and future. And hopefully, it's all conversation and food for thought about how we go to improve protecting our bay and the surrounds, but also, complementing that with how we live, work and play. So thanks again. And this is just a little shout out for, we do have one more event, and it's going to be a field trip to Clifton Springs area to see the Dell Eco Reef, which is a really good example of adapting to beach erosion and creating reef structures there just off the coast to protect our beaches and coastal environment. So details for that to come very shortly. That will be on the Sunday, the 26th of May. Too. So, and that will be a free event and will be first in best dress. So keep an eye out on your inboxes for that in the coming week. Anything else from you, Paul, before we clock off for this evening?
Just a huge thanks for our speakers giving up their time on a what day are we up to? Wednesday nights. And thanks to our audience for hanging in there.
Great. Thanks again, everyone, and thanks again for support from the Victorian Government to run these series. So thank you again. If you're playing at home, you can log off now, and we'll hopefully see you at some point soon.